Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson. My introduction to this week's podcast. Lindsay Chervinsky is back. My dear friend, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. So much in demand these days. It's hard to get on her calendar. We're doing it as often as we can. Almost the number one thing people say to me around the country is, more Lindsay, more Lindsay. I try not to take that personally. More Lindsay, more Lindsay. And I agree. We have such fun together. And I wish you could see it. I wish we had a little ditto cam so you could see her choking, sneering, gagging, rolling her eyes, and all the other things she does when I try to defend poor Mr. Jefferson. But that's all right. Anyway, we agree on almost everything, it turns out, but it's fun to spar with her, at least in a playful way. This is really an important program, I think. We're talking about the First Amendment and its weaknesses. So the point I made in the program at some point is that whenever we're in a real or perceived national security emergency, World War I, the Civil War, the quasi-war of 1798, which led to the Alien and Sedition laws, whenever we're in a period of real or perceived national emergency, the First Amendment suffers, and we erode it. Normally, after things calm down, when the French do not invade in 1798, when the communists do not try to take over in 1917, when the Japanese are not a threat to the country in World War II, normally, when the crisis ends, there's a return. The pendulum moves back towards a greater adherence to the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. But it doesn't always go fully back. So take 9/11. There was some serious erosion of freedom of expression after 9/11. And almost immediately after that catastrophe, the Patriot Act was trotted out, a huge piece of legislation. That wasn't written in 2 days. That legislation was sitting on a shelf waiting for its moment, and the Patriot Act is still in effect. Well, maybe the worst case is the Insurrection Act, which occurred during Jefferson's second term when we were in not a war, but we were in a war scare over impressment of sailors by the British, attacks on our free shipping. Both the French and the British were discriminating against American trade. Because they were caught in what they regarded as a world war of existential survival, and they were willing to damage the United States to survive, which makes sense from their point of view, but none from ours or from the rule of international law. And so during that period, the Insurrection Act was passed. It's being invoked in the 21st century. So there are people in every administration that has autocratic impulses, and it's not just Republicans, of course, but every administration that has some autocratic impulses goes looking around in the law codes for old cases that are still technically on the books that can be trotted out and used in this situation. And the Espionage Act of 1918 is one. The Insurrection Act of Jefferson's second term is one. The Comstock laws that were prevalent in the post-Civil War period have been used to justify the outlawing of abortion, etc. That the people who are looking for ostensibly legal ways to do things that are not popular scour through the legal books to see what is still valid, which still has legal possibility. I think we need a sunset law that says a law that hasn't been invoked for X number of years must automatically be renewed by explicit vote of the Congress of the United States, and that we should sunset all of these things because they're misused. Are we really being invaded at the present moment? Truly, are we being invaded? Is this a time for the Insurrection Act? Is there a No Kings protest movement where maybe 20 million or 5 million people nationwide march on a Saturday? Is that an insurrection? Is that an invasion? Is that a national emergency? And so almost always the invocation of such things is a terrible mistake, and almost always it backfires at some point. So I think that's important. But today's program with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky was about the First Amendment, its critics, and its vulnerability in times of real or perceived national emergency. And it sort of was precipitated by Secretary of War Pete Hegseth's decision to demand that the press, the Fourth Estate, vet anything that they're going to write with censors in the Defense Department before it goes to those newspapers. And an almost unanimous response of no, ain't going to do it has come from the media. And I think, thank goodness they're doing that. I hope that that's enough. I hope that that pushback, which is casual, I mean, you can say we're not going to do it, but that doesn't mean that the Department of Defense adheres to that reaction. It's not binding to object. I would hope that the courts, including the Supreme Court, would defend freedom of the press in a situation like this. You can't be too sure. And I think Dr. Chervinsky said, yeah, we hope that the courts would be the final protection of the Bill of Rights, but at this moment, you can't be too sure. So really, it's going to take the American people and what Jefferson sometimes called the decided will of the American people. I would hope that the decided will of the American people is for virtually unlimited freedom of the press. I would hope that the decided will of the American people is that presidents can't impound funds that have been appropriated by Congress. I would hope that the decided will of the American people is that presidents can't take emoluments from foreign nations. I would hope that the decided will of the American people is that election results, once certified, must be accepted by all people as how things work in a democratic republic, etc. If the people express themselves in an unmistakable way on behalf of well-established norms and laws in the United States, that's more likely to succeed than just whining about it. So it's a very important program. We talk about the Washington administration and the press, the Adams administration and the press, the Jefferson administration and the press, a little bit on the Lincoln administration, more on Theodore Roosevelt, of freedom of expression, and so on. And so where we are today is a very, very, very upsetting and dangerous time. And I would hope that all Americans, whatever your politics, maybe you think that the current administration is right about tough love in America, about reform, about that the system is broken. That's all legitimate, of course. But I would hope that everybody would say, well, wait a minute, we need a free press. We need a virtually unlimited freedom of the press. Dissent is essential. Dissent is essential to American democracy. And we must protect it even when it offends, even when it hurts our feelings, even when we can't stand it. We should say, I disagree with what you say, but I shall defend to the death your right to say it. So anyway, I'm so glad to be back on the range with my friend, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. We'll see you soon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and I'm very glad to look at Lindsay Chervinsky. She was in her office at the Presidential Library of George Washington. I'm in my beloved North Dakota, and we're talking today about the First Amendment and presidential anxiety, concern, dislike at times of the First Amendment. So welcome, Lindsay.
Well, thank you very much for having me back. It's good to see your face.
Lots of people keep asking for you. Everywhere I go, they, Lindsay, Lindsay, Lindsay. I say, Marcia, Marcia, Marcia. Okay, we love her. Of course we do. But do you have to gush all the time? But they do. And so they really appreciate our conversations. They love it when you beat up on me. I tell them I remove 82% of all of your abuse, and still it comes through. So there you go.
You know, I've listened to the episodes. You hardly remove anything. You're a good sport.
I'm a good sport. You know, I love it when we have disputes. I actually do. I think it's really important. And people keep asking me, what is the deal? You know, what's the chemistry between you and Lindsay? And I say, well, she is of a different generation. She's of a different gender. She grew up without the Jefferson kind of miasma of that we must always apologize for everything that Jefferson does. And these are really important things. She's never had either the burden or the joy of inheriting, impersonating one of these characters. So we bring really interesting, different ways of seeing to the same thing. And I keep telling them we almost always agree, which I'm frankly, sort of astonished by. But on the occasions when we disagree, it's usually playful. I don't know of a single instance where we actually seriously disagree.
No, I don't really think we have. You were pretty mad at me for one line in my book that I refused to recant, but I don't think
I
that
wasn't
that
mad.
was
I just thought, what a terrible cheap shot,
I don't take this personally. I don't think you do either. I mean, I love history, but I don't. There's so many people are protective of the person they write about. I'm not protective of Jefferson. And it seems to me that that's why Jefferson is taking such a beating in our time, because so many people have protected him for the last couple of generations. Yeah. And now that we have to face the fact that he wasn't really the saint, the term I was thinking about as I prepared for our program, the apostle of liberty that he's called, he is the apostle of liberty, but there's some tarnish, there's some rust, isn't there?
There is. Well, and we've talked a lot about his role with the freedom of religion part of the First Amendment, which is where I think you and I are in the most agreement on Jefferson, that I think it's his greatest contribution, his greatest strength, and where he is most admirable. Certainly the First Amendment piece is a little bit more complicated, but that gets really into what we're going to talk about today, which is that all presidents have a complicated relationship with it because no one really likes to be criticized. I mean, I've yet to meet anyone who thinks that's great fun. And presidents often feel misunderstood, but that is the point of the First Amendment, is to provide criticism.
Exactly. And so I think it's fair to say that almost every president in American history has been annoyed by the press and has regarded it as unfair and has felt victimized and has the desire to strike back somehow. Few do, some do, and it almost always backfires. And one of the reasons that we're having this conversation, and we both want to avoid too much contemporary politics, is that the Defense Department is attempting to determine what is reported about what goes on inside that pentagonal building by saying you must submit your proposed report, your dispatch to us for approval before we will permit it to go out. And almost every major news organization has flatly rejected this and said that's not how it works. That is not how the First Amendment works. One or two entities have said that they will comply, and I doubt that that's true either. But anyway, this isn't the first time this has happened. We're not suggesting that the Trump administration is unique in this, although it is pretty aggressive, let's put it, in wanting to shape the way the news is reported. But let's provide what we do at our best. Let's provide some historical context for this. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with your man, George Washington. I don't think he ever censored the press, but he got annoyed.
He did. Well, and I actually would like to start a little bit before then, because I think there's some misunderstanding about what the First Amendment says and what the point of what's called the Fourth Estate is. And I think that's pretty important to this tradition. So the Fourth Estate is a concept that comes from European society, in which there were three estates. There was the clergy, there was the nobility, and then there was the common man. And this was most easily seen in France, especially in the ancient regime, where you literally had those three groups represented in what was their legislature. In the 18th century, in particular in England, as you started to have a more powerful parliament, you started to have the rise of a press that often supported the opposition party. And this is, of course, a loyal opposition. So this was the concept that you could disagree with the people in power and not be traitorous. And as the press started to grow, it started to be referred to as the Fourth Estate. So that's where that concept comes from. American colonies, and then, of course, the American states were steeped in that tradition, and it was very much how they saw the political system. And the purpose of the press was to hold power to account. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging the right of freedom of speech and petition. And what that means is that the government cannot restrict or punish you for speech, with, of course, a few minor exceptions in terms of rhetoric designed to invoke violence in a very particular way. It does not apply to private businesses. It does not apply to individuals, and it does not apply to sort of society writ large. So oftentimes people say, well, yes, you have a First Amendment right, but that doesn't give you the right to avoid consequences. That is only true with the federal government. It is not necessarily true with private businesses. So just had to lay that context there, because I listen to focus groups sometimes and people will say that, and I just want to be like, no, from the government, not from private business.
So let's just say that the NFL or General Motors decides they will not permit their employees to say certain things about certain situations. That's perfectly legal.
Yep.
It's only the United States government that is forbidden to prevent freedom of expression or to punish it after it has been uttered, except in very, very limited cases.
Yes. Now, we might not like that. We might think that private businesses or the NFL or, General Motors should have a different policy, and that's a totally appropriate conversation to have. But there is no First Amendment protection for people who are employed by the NFL.
Why did the Founding Fathers think that this was as important as it is? Now, it's not necessarily that the First Amendment means that it was first in priority, but why did the founders think that this was an essential protection?
Well, under absolute monarchies and even more limited monarchies like the British monarchy by the 18th century, kings don't like criticism any more than presidents do. And they would often crack down on newspaper editors. They would imprison them. They would destroy their presses. This was very much a part of an oppressive regime. And you could be punished for even petitioning. So if you submitted a petition to Parliament and it was critical of the government, you could be punished for that. And so the rights, we often I don't think we think of petitions all that much, but, imagine you could be punished for saying scurrilous things on Twitter about the president or the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense. It is an anathema to us, but that was very much par for the course in certainly 17th and sometimes 18th century France and Great Britain.
Yes, and we should remind our listeners that newspapers were a relatively new technology. So there are no newspapers in the 14th century or the 15th century or even the 16th century. It's really a late 17th and 18th century phenomenon. And so it had the same kind of alarming quality that the internet or that social media have today, that suddenly the Parliament of Britain or the Ancien regime in France is confronted with these broadsides or press statements, and they're wondering who has this technology and how dare they do this sort of thing. We live in a time when, and I think this is one of the ironies of this conversation, Lindsay, we live in a time when we think that essentially anything goes in a free press, but that's not always true in American history, and it's being tested at this moment.
It is, and I think you make a really good point that there was a real panic with the rise of newspapers, a sense that the world was ending, that it was going to destroy society. That was also true when, the radio was first emerged, when television first emerged, when photography first emerged. Anytime there's a new technology, that changes the way we communicate and radically alters society, there is this panic. Getting to your question about Washington, I think that there's a very important difference between how presidents felt about the First Amendment and their actions in office. And Washington is a great example. Washington was very thin-skinned. Washington hated criticism. And from, let's say, 1782 to 1793, he experienced almost none of it. And so in 1793, when he started to receive some criticism over the French Revolution and the American role in the war between France and Great Britain, he hated it. And it was his biggest concern that serving in a political capacity would undermine this unbelievably sterling reputation he had. Now, as a newspaper junkie, he absolutely loved news. He had subscriptions to tons of different newspapers, including initially the Philadelphia Aurora, which was published by Benjamin Franklin. Do you say Bache or Bosch? I've heard both.
We're supposed to say Beach, I think, but it's not Bosch. It's
Bache, however we're pronouncing it.
Whatever it is.
Whatever his name is. BFB. He delivered 3 copies every single day to the president's house just to annoy Washington. And it worked. Washington would rant.
There's an incident, isn't there?
Oh, there is. So there's this great description of a cabinet meeting in which I think when Henry Knox got bored, he would, or like if the conversation wasn't going the way he wanted or something, he would change the subject to something that he knew would intentionally frustrate Washington. And so he somehow brought up this newspaper, and Washington, lost his temper and starts yelling about this newspaper and BFB and saying that he was intentionally doing it to be impudent and to get under his skin, which he did. And yet he said nothing publicly because he had two important thoughts. One, it was beneath the dignity of the office to respond to that type of criticism, that the presidency had to be above the scurrilous, debate in the newspapers, and it had to be such a distinguished office that it couldn't acknowledge this type of criticism. The other important part was he understood the power of the presidency. And for all that BFB really annoyed Washington, he was still one lone editor barely making it by. And so to punch down legally by responding to this editor would have been inappropriate.
I'm talking with the great Lindsay Chervinsky. We're talking about the First Amendment and the dignity of office and free speech. We need to take a short break. When we come back, we will go to the next two presidents, your man John Adams and my man Thomas Jefferson. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Back after a short absence is Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Her life has become so complicated. She's on the news every single day now. Every time I turn on the news, oh, there's Lindsay. And it's great to watch you. And then you have your new book, of course, on John Adams. And now you have this extraordinary job as a very young person as the executive director of the Washington Presidential Library, and on and on and on. It's just fantastic. I'm sure you're under almost unbelievable pressure to go all over the country as America approaches its 250th birthday. I don't know how you manage your time, and I'm pretty sure your dog, Quincy, is not too happy with you at this point in your career. But let's go to John Adams. So Washington didn't prosecute anybody, but he had the thin skin and was easily annoyed. And frankly, let me just say one last word about that. He had reason to be upset, and part of it is Jefferson. Because Jefferson and James Madison decided that the press was too favorable to the Washington administration, and they pushed hard to get Philip Freneau, who had been a classmate of Madison's at Princeton, to start an opposition newspaper. And Freneau didn't want to do it, but they eventually persuaded him to start this paper. And this was made possible in part by Jefferson using a State Department job as a translator for Freneau so that he would have an income while he got this paper up and running. I think the best that can be said of this, Lindsay, is that this does not put Mr. Jefferson, who is the Secretary of State, in a very good light.
No, and not only did he have every right to be frustrated about that use of State Department resources, but as we've talked about in the past, newspaper standards were quite different in the 1790s than they were in, let's say, the 1970s. And so notice I did not say today. And so one of Washington's frustrations later in his presidency was that the newspapers were printing that he was going to be in certain places, and he had no intention of doing so. And he understood that the purpose of that was that people would show up and he wouldn't be there and they would be disappointed in him. And so they were just printing lies, or they would print that he died. And he was totally fine. And so, he did have real reason to be frustrated with what he was seeing on the page.
But Jefferson was clearly being disloyal. I don't know if he was legally disloyal, but disloyal to a man who appointed him to be the first Secretary of State and then attempted to undermine that administration from within. The Roman virtuous thing to do is to resign at that point and say, I can no longer support this administration and so on. That's not how Jefferson handled it. All right, so we go to Adams. And if there was deference for Washington, at first, as you said, everybody knew he's the hero of the Revolution. He's the father of the country. He's the great George Washington. And so people were pretty cautious about criticizing him, at least in his first term. Not so much in the second term, but nobody felt that way about John Adams. John Adams did not. Nobody thought, we must protect the great man. It was easy to make fun of John Adams. It was fun to be derisive about him. He was not immune to criticism. He handled it, I think, better than George Washington because he would fight right back. That's what I love about Adams, is that he was not just going to take it, and the dignity of office meant something different to him from what it meant to Washington. But as you well know, as everybody knows, in 1798, we were involved in an undeclared naval war with France, and there was a lot of war hysteria in the country. And Adams, I don't think himself was caught up in that hysteria, but he allowed the Federalist Party to overreact, I think, to the French threat. And in doing so, the Congress of the United States passed the Alien Enemies Law and the Sedition Law and the Naturalization Laws. Jefferson, who is now out of office, back at Monticello, said these are worthy of the 9th or 10th century. They are palpable violations of the Bill of Rights. I think that's true. But the Supreme Court was silent on this question. Adams was not particularly in favor of the sedition law, I don't think, his wife more so than he, but I don't think that he was really one of the backers of it. He signed it, but I don't think that he was a full-on advocate of it. I'd love your opinion about that. But the fact is that this was the first case in our constitutional history of the government suppressing freedom of expression.
Yes. A couple of other details. You're right that I don't think he was necessarily an advocate of it, although once it was on the books, he wasn't particularly upset to see particular editors prosecuted.
Including Bate.
Yes, up until that point, he really actually, it was interesting because he didn't say much publicly. He didn't really respond to the newspaper criticisms when he gave his addresses to Congress. He wasn't really talking about newspapers. I mean, he was complaining about it privately, of course, and very frustrated, but he was trying to kind of hold himself to Washington standard. And I think you and I talked at some length in a previous episode when we talked about my book about the context around the Alien and Sedition Acts and the fact that there was a lot of political violence in the streets and newspapers were calling for violence and getting a response. And there weren't the same sort of jurisprudential limitations on the First Amendment that we saw today. And there wasn't the same sort of jurisdictional protections for editors because Supreme Court review was still kind of fuzzy and the entire judiciary was stacked with Federalists. So it was a, sort of a multifaceted, challenging problem. But I do think it was, it's absolutely a dark mark on Adams' presidency. It is an area where he, I think, later came to regret it. It also backfired. So you were talking earlier in the episode about the rise of Democratic Republican newspapers. The explosion happened in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so it did the opposite of what it was intended to do.
The Alien and Sedition laws were a terrible mistake, and they backfired because they helped to elect Jefferson in 1800. Adams, as we have said, was not a fierce advocate of the sedition law, but he wasn't afraid to use it. And his wife was pretty sure it should be used because she took that, the attacks on her husband's basic integrity very, very seriously.
Yes, she did. And, not to excuse it, but like there was before these bills were passed, the month before, there was a death threat delivered to the house and they had no security and they had no fence and there was no, Secret Service. And so I don't in any way want to suggest that we should allow fear to corrupt our constitutional principles. But I do think that from her perspective, it wasn't just, insulting. It was genuine fear for safety.
I'm glad you said that because I think people may not, here's where we can provide context. We think, okay, they really overreacted to that. The French threat was really never very much of a threat. However, the French Revolution, if I can use a Chervinsky-esque term, freaked out
the American establishment. A term I would never have used in my own scholarship, but I'll use your kind of 21st century slang. They freaked out over it. And so,
I'm
but
such
it's true.
a good influence on you.
Oh man, the vulgarization of my life. But at any rate, they did freak out, and Adams wrote that famous letter to Jefferson when they reconciled, saying, "What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson?" He said, "In Philadelphia, there were mobs assembling. They were going to attack." He said, "We gave firearms to our servants in the president's house in case we had to defend our lives against this vicious Frenchified Jacobin mob." And again, that's an overreaction, but it's not without a germ of real fear.
Well, and what's interesting is, Jefferson many years later told him it was an overreaction. But if you look at Jefferson's letters from the night of the mob they're talking about, he said it wasn't safe to go outside.
Fair enough. But my point is that the French Revolution rocked this country and it distorted the political process. It made Washington do things that probably were unnecessary. It made Adams overreact in this situation. The Jeffersonians made the terrible mistake of kind of signing on to the French Revolution. And then when the terror came, they were put into a very embarrassing situation, although Jefferson never failed for the rest of his life to defend the terror and said it was unnecessary bloodletting, etc. But now I wish that our listeners could watch you here on Zoom, because I'm about to make your eyes roll right into the back of your head. And maybe you'll even gesture in defiance, because Jefferson, of course, is the apostle of liberty, isn't he? And I do think, generally speaking, he was restrained on a federal level. I do believe that that was his view, that the Bill of Rights didn't necessarily apply in quite the same way within states as it does to the national government, and so on. But the fact is, he was as thin-skinned as anybody, and maybe more vindictive.
Yes, well, I mean, he certainly was more clever in his vindictive behavior, because by encouraging state level prosecutions, he kept his hands free of it, which was a much wiser course of action. My favorite Jefferson press story is that as president, he kept a clip book of all of his newspaper coverage, but he only kept the good coverage.
Yeah, but Lindsay, you know, when Alexander von Humboldt came to visit him in 1804, when the Lusaka expedition was just getting started, Humboldt is the great traveler, explorer, ethnologist of the period, and he came to visit the great man of the Enlightenment in Washington. And this story may be apocryphal, but it's well reported that at the end of his time, he was waiting in one of the lobbies of the White House for Jefferson, who was busy with something, and he found this newspaper on some sort of a shelf, and it was a vicious, scurrilous attack on Jefferson, personal, very mean-spirited attack. And when Jefferson came out to greet the great German explorer, von Humboldt said, "How can this be? How can you permit this to occur? I mean, this is outrageous." And Jefferson said, "Oh, Baron, put that in your pocket. And when you go back to the old world and they ask what freedom means, show them this."
Are you gagging?
No, I'm laughing. It's
a great story.
It's a great story. I don't know if it happened, but it's a very Jeffersonian thing to do, because he said all the right things in public.
And he was mostly good in private, but he was the first to survive a sex scandal in office. It was in 1802 in September, when James Callender, now his enemy, published the Sally Hemings story that had been circulating back in Virginia for a very long time, sort of under the radar mostly, kind of rumors about what goes on at Monticello. And of course, what went on at Monticello went on at almost every plantation in the South. So we should not be particularly surprised that preying on enslaved women was a part of the mix for most plantations. But Jefferson was Jefferson, so he's supposed to be above all of that. And so when the Sally Hemings story finally broke in 1802 in September, Jefferson had to endure that. And he didn't do anything about it except never, ever speak about it, never responded. That was his way to handle it, which is, I think, a very intelligent way to handle such things, probably impossible now. But he endured that. It must have been a source of great shame to him. And I'm sure that he would have liked Callender to die, which Callender soon did, drowned in 3 feet of water in Richmond. And I've always wondered about that story. I would love to have the Callender cam along the James River to see exactly what happened on that occasion. I'm not suggesting anything nefarious, but it was convenient, wasn't it, that Callender suddenly died in the midst of this scandal?
It was. That's very conspiratorial of you.
No, and I don't want to suggest.
You're not the first. No, and you're not the first to do so. I mean, I think you're right that it is notably interesting that it happened at that moment. But, it actually gets at, I think, a pretty interesting part of the presidential relationship with the press, because for a long time, the story wasn't circulating, and it wasn't that Jefferson didn't have opponents. I mean, Hamilton could have circulated it in a newspaper and he didn't. Adams could have circulated it. They heard rumors of it and they talked about it in their family letters, and they didn't. And for a long time, presidents and the press sort of had a secret agreement that there were certain things that one did not discuss. President Harding had a series of mistresses. And in fact, as I understand it, and maybe this is apocryphal too, but there's a great story that at one point his wife found out about one of them, and the Secret Service had to throw him in a closet to protect him against his wife because she was coming after him with like scissors or something like that.
Let's go to Theodore Roosevelt. I know a lot about this story, and I know you do too. Tell us about his relationship with the press.
Well, we might have to do this in multiple parts because there's so much good stuff here. You know, the concept of the bully pulpit is really a Theodore Roosevelt's invention. I mean, there of course what is the bully pulpit, which is the president's power to communicate with the American people, and maybe the duty to do so as a form of leadership is of course been there from the beginning. But he was, I think, the first person. Yes, and he embodied it in a way that few people could. Now, he was able to do so partly, of course, because the telegraph existed. So, you know, his speeches could be conveyed across the country immediately. And the rise of photography made his presence and his power, I think, exceptionally well known. But my favorite Theodore Roosevelt story is that when he was in the White House, he understood the relationship with the press was really important. And this is a theme we're going to circle back to, because presidents can work the press if they know how to do it right. And so he would invite—
No one ever did it better. No one ever did it better than T.R.
Well, Franklin Roosevelt might be a second. He was pretty darn good too. But Theodore Roosevelt could make great friends with them. He could have this camaraderie with them, and he would invite them in every morning while he was having his morning shave. And
he was being shaved.
Yes. So he had his barber who was, you know, using a straight razor, as one did at that point, to give him his shave. And he used to talk to them, and then he would say, after he told stories, what was on and off the record. And often the really great stories were off the record, which I'm sure was extremely frustrating to these newspaper editors. So occasionally when the journalists would get frustrated, they would ask him a question that they knew would infuriate him, just as the barber's blade was sort of coming up under his Adam's apple. And he would leap up in frustration, as he did, because he was really the epitome of what it meant to be vigorous. And the barber would have to very carefully whip the razor out so as to not decapitate the president. And it kind of became a running joke with the journalists of how close they could get him to killing himself with the barber.
To being sliced in the
carotid.
But there's more to that too. So he formed what he called the Ananias Club. And the Ananias Club meant that we have this code. If I tell you it's off limits, you cannot report it. I'll tell you lots of things, but if you report them, you'll be banished. And he was working from the book of Acts, chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And a man named Ananias was one of the early adherents to the cult of Christianity. He did not turn over his money. This was at the time when there was a communitarian pooling of money by the apostles, and he kept back some money that he had been paid, and for that God struck him dead. And so the Ananias Club was something that Roosevelt invented and said, if you upset me, if you violate the code, you will not be back. They all loved him. Even the ones who were frustrated loved him. They couldn't get enough of him because he was so good, so colorful, so funny, and so over the top in everything that he did. And very few people actually suffered under the Ananias Club because the agreement held up. That wouldn't hold up today, not for a minute.
Well, and he had started doing this before he was president, because he brought along a photographer with him to Cuba. So the, Rough Riders, their glory was captured by photography, which is only possible if you know how to actually spin a narrative. And that accessibility that he provided is something, we certainly don't generally have journalists agreeing to those rules today, but the concept of access journalism, that you kind of have to play ball to get access, that is still something that is discussed frequently with newspapers and TV producers and journalists, of how much are you willing to sort of play ball in order to maintain access to sources.
We need to take a break. Before I do, I just want to tell you one more quick story about that. After he was in Cuba, what he called his crowded hour, he wrote a book called The Rough Riders, which was a very interesting book, kind of modeled after Julius Caesar's accounts of the Gallic Wars in France. And one of his favorite newspaper columnists in Chicago reviewed the book and said, "It's a great book. Oh, man, this guy can really write." He said, "The only thing I disagree with is the title." He said it shouldn't have been called The Rough Riders. It should have been called Alone in Cuba.
Why alone?
Because it was all about him.
Oh.
We'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome back. This is fun. Lindsay Chervinsky back by popular demand, sneering at Jefferson. We're laughing about Theodore Roosevelt. We're going to move into a little bit more serious territory here. Woodrow Wilson. So let me just offer you a proposition, Lindsay. The First Amendment is a great and heroic thing, and it holds up pretty well, except in times of perceived or real national emergency. And then erosion begins to creep in. So Alien and Sedition Law in 1798, when there's a perceived war scare with France. Now we have World War I. We've left out Lincoln for the moment. We can come back to that if you like. But in World War I, we overreacted and we passed the Espionage Act of 1918. And it was used to do a great deal of censorship. And many people suffered under the Espionage Act. Wilson was, at least his administration, was exceedingly thin-skinned, and it hid behind the question of national security. So in other words, instead of just saying we can't stand this criticism, the argument was the very security of the United States is being jeopardized by this sort of unscrupulous publication. And so this is one of the sadder, darker moments in American history, in my view.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. So this is, the often referred to as the one of the Red Scares, and then the Palmer raids are, of course, there have been other Red Scares, but this is kind of the first one where there's this sense that as part of World War I, there's also this Bolshevik threat, and it kind of all culminates in this suppression of various different groups within society, and not a whole lot of evidence that there was anything there. So, and I'd be curious if you have this sense, but as I've studied history, I think most historians tend to give more leniency to Lincoln and more leniency to FDR, setting aside Japanese internment, because that's a different story. But in recognition that there was a Nazi threat in the United States, there were sort of underground circles that were trying to undermine the government and trying to undermine the United States and bring the United States into the Nazi fold. And of course, in the Civil War, it's a civil war. So your enemy is quite literally at the gate. And so there's a sense that in real threat and in real wartime, that certain concessions do have to be made. And I think most people feel that the Civil War and World War II are those appropriate types of crises, and World War I was overstated.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's perfectly said, Dr. Chervinsky. So, the gravest crisis in American history was the Civil War. Lincoln is more often regarded as the man who suspended habeas corpus than as a man who censored the press, but there was some of that too. I wish that our current Secretary of Homeland Security understood what habeas corpus is, but that's another question. The second gravest crisis is World War II, the Great Depression, World War II, the attack on Pearl Harbor and what followed. Clearly, we overreacted with respect to Japanese Americans. That's one of the more shameful moments in American history. But it sort of goes to my broad thesis that in times of real or perceived national crisis, especially security crises, the First Amendment does not hold as an absolute. And maybe that's important. Remember, and this is, again, Jefferson saying the right thing. He said at some point, I think after his presidency, doubtless adhering to constitutional norms is one of the most important things you do as a government. But he said it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that you survive. And there may be times, he said, when to survive as a nation, we have to carefully and hesitatingly and sorrowfully erode some of our freedoms because survival is the only thing. If you lose the country, you've lost everything. And of course, that could be used and abused, but you agree that this is probably the truth.
Oh, I completely agree. It's the truth. I think the question is always, is the emergency actually an emergency?
And who decides?
Are the emergency powers actually being used to target the real threat? Are they being used to target political opponents? And is there, I would add two additional things to that, including, do we as a society learn from it? Often in the past, we've, Japanese internment is a great example. It took a very long time, but eventually the Supreme Court did say this is not an appropriate use of the Alien Enemies Act, and this was a national tragedy. So, learning from it, reconciling from it, and especially with emergency powers, is there an end to them? So, we actually have a lot of emergency powers on the books right now for emergencies that were declared a long time ago that are sort of fuzzy and nebulous in nature. The War Powers Act is one of them. And so you need to have an endpoint because emergencies are not indefinite.
And you want, and this is not necessarily a criticism of the present moment, but you want your Supreme Court to stand outside the process and say, I'm not so sure this is an insurrection. I'm not so sure this is a grave emergency. I'm not so sure this is existential. In other words, their duty is to side with freedom against power unless they are absolutely convinced that this is a time when that must be suspended. That has not always been the case. In fact, it's almost never the case. The court upheld Japanese internment when it happened. The court upheld a lot of the Red Scare. Let me just give you an example of this because it's a North Dakota example. And I don't know if you know who Kate Richards O'Hare is, but you're going to want to because she was an anti-war rabble-rouser during World War I. And, the rap on that was back when we were so innocent. One of the raps on the war was that this is a munitions war, that the munitions industry is ginning up this crisis, that they're going to profit from this. And Gerald P. Nye, senator from North Dakota, voted against the war because he said this is really just capitalism, the munitions industry promoting war. Are we sure we really need one? So she comes to Bowman, North Dakota, which is in southwestern North Dakota, in 1917, when the war is underway, and she gave this fiery speech in which she said, "Our American women are being turned into brood sows for warriors who are going to go get themselves killed." So our American women are being persuaded to be complicit in creating young men for slaughter. And so she was promptly arrested under a federal court system, tried in Bismarck. She was sent to prison, I think in Fort Leavenworth, where she became an advocate for prisoner reform. She's a fabulous person. Kate Richards O'Hare, July 17th, 1917, Bowman, North Dakota, the Brood Sows lecture. And one of the other members of the Nonpartisan League, which was it had an anti-war view during this. They were really a farmers' protection organization, but their anti-war material got them in trouble. And A.C. Townley, the great rabble-rousing leader of the Nonpartisan League, said, maybe we should, he said, instead of sending our lean farm boys over to France, let's send some of the fat plutocrats and bankers. They're fat. They'll be better targets, for which he went to prison in Jackson, Minnesota. So you see, you laugh out loud at this. It's ludicrous, it's appalling, but it happens.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think that's just an example of, are the powers actually being used to target the threat? And so for example, in World War II, some of the limitations on the press were to restrict Nazi propaganda that was being sent through the mail. That, to me, is an appropriate use of these emergency powers when you are at war with the Nazi Germany. Someone, making fun of the weight of plutocrats is probably not.
I love it though. Because it's such a great use of satire. Instead, you could have a long op-ed piece about this, but saying, let's just send some of those overweight plutocrats. That appeals to almost everybody who understood what was at stake there. So, we're romping through American history on this. I want to talk a little bit about the Pentagon Papers. So I was alive then, you weren't. The war had soured. This was 1971. A study that was funded and directed by Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, as it was called then, looked at the war, and the results were devastating. That the American people had been lied to from the very beginning. They were lied to by Eisenhower. They were lied to by John Kennedy. They were lied to by LBJ. And that the war, that we had been fed misinformation throughout, and that the war had gone much more badly than anyone thought, and that the executives of all these executives of both parties had been warned time and again that the war couldn't be won, and so on and so forth. It was a devastating report. It was leaked by a man named Daniel Ellsberg. He actually photocopied it secretly and got it to the New York Times and then the Washington Post. It was published. There was a restraining order. It went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and on a 6-3 vote on June 30th, 1971, the Supreme Court said no, prior restraint is not acceptable in a free society. That violates the First Amendment. And the Pentagon Papers were then widely published with devastating effect on America's support, what was left of it, for the war. So this is, along with Sullivan in 1964, Croswell, which we haven't talked about, Hamilton's case way back in the early national period, and now the Pentagon Papers. The Supreme Court has, at its best, has worked hard to protect freedom of expression, even when it is deeply upsetting to the American establishment.
Yes, and I think it is one of our greatest strengths. I mean, it is the thing that actually, there's all this social science about how and political science about how democracies tend to move a lot slower than authoritarian regimes, and they can get a lot of things wrong in the short term, but in the long term, they actually tend to be more effective, more victorious, more inclined to reform. And it's because you have disclosures like this one, that you can't actually have inefficiency, corruption, destruction, malfeasance for so long, because it will be uncovered and displayed.
Yes, and I think we're testing your proposition, I think, at this moment about whether in the long run democracies, however they wind up defining themselves, if we're still a democracy, we may be, it's not quite clear what we are at the moment, but whether democracies can self-correct over the long term, I think that's an open question at the moment, and we'll find out over the next 10 or 15 years. But I think we agree on this. I'm grounded, I'm guardedly, minimally optimistic that we will always come through.
To quote the great Abraham Lincoln, I am optimistic because I don't see the point in being anything else.
Of course, or you could quote Winston Churchill, America always winds up doing the right thing after it's exhausted all the wrong things that it can possibly do. Yes. All well said. Loss of respect for institutions, most recently the Supreme Court, the media, the Congress, the presidency, even organized religion, the police. The military has actually held pretty well until now, but almost every other American institution has lower support by the American people than ever before. And I don't see how exactly that gets turned around. So, and I want to say too, Lindsay, this is not just this administration and this president. Both parties have richly deserved the contempt of the American people for broken promises, for lies, for being entirely dependent upon big money and so on. It would be a mistake to think that this is just the current moment in the current administration, however much they're exaggerating some of these things.
Well, I mean, one of the points that Greg made last night, which I think is such a good one, is, Biden ran the Democratic Party and Biden ran on restoring democracy, restoring norms, restoring normalcy, and they got back in power and they did absolutely nothing to prevent against the breaking of norms and customs. They did absolutely nothing to restrain presidential or executive power because they didn't want to. They did absolutely nothing to protect voting rights. And, and there were some efforts, but there could have been a lot more. There are a lot of things they could have done. They could have done it in bipartisan fashion and they didn't. And so that is a failure of leadership.
Indeed. I agree with that. I'm sorry I wasn't there. It sounds marvelous. You're convening some really important things, and that's a new set of initiatives for presidential libraries. So just to talk about that for a minute, Watergate. After Watergate, the Congress of the United States passed new legislation to create new guardrails against some of the abuses of the Nixon administration. I think we should have a bunch of new laws. One on, certification of election, of course. There was a half-hearted one after January 6th.
Yeah, I would add we desperately need to reform the Insurrection Act. It's been on the books for way too long.
From our time. This goes back to Jefferson.
Oh, it's ridiculous. I think we There's the emoluments clause, but that clearly needs to have some teeth applied to it. So there are a lot of things. And what's important about the reforms in Watergate is that they were not partisan, that they were a bipartisan response to what was seen as corruption in the system. And at some point, we need to get to the point where this can be a bipartisan effort to make sure that the government works better for the people.
Well, let's leave that. I agree with you. There are other things that I would do. I would say that the candidate must pledge under oath that she or he will concede if the election can be shown to have been fair. In other words, we could shore this up if we really felt like it in a lot of different ways. We just have not yet done that. And I think once this moment in American history is gone, so 30 years from now, 20 years from now, I think there will be reforms along these lines. I think everyone's kind of afraid to touch it at the moment. So let's close with this. We've got about 2 minutes here. We should go back to the Croswell case just for a moment. 1804, Alexander Hamilton usually gets bad marks on all these questions, gets high marks here. And in that case, he helped to create a new standard for libel action, that the libel had to be malicious in intent, but that truth was a defense. And so if you can prove that, for example, John Adams was taking bribes from France or England, you can't just prosecute that because you hate to have it said. If the defense can say, well, we have a receipt, we can actually prove the bribe, then that's a defense. And so that was the biggest breakthrough in freedom of expression of the Jeffersonian era.
Yeah, it's a critical one. And it's actually one of the reasons our laws are more protective of freedom of speech than a lot of others, because there is that key element of protection.
Last question for today. Do you think that the nearly unanimous reaction by the Fourth Estate, by the press, to the attempt by the Defense Department, by the War Department to pre-censor news will succeed?
Yes.
You think the First Amendment is that strong in the minds of the American people?
Well, I don't know if it will succeed because of the American people, but today I saw a clip that Bret Baier and a couple of the other Fox News hosts were talking about how this is unacceptable, and that when they were covering the Pentagon, that's not how they did things. And that, of course, Pentagon reporters are respectful of classified spaces, and that's what you do in the White House as well. And that it's important. That's not journalism, is being spoon-fed. And that was remarkable. And that's right. And that's correct. And that is how journalism should work. They should collectively push back against efforts to silence their work. And I think that if they can hold firm, then they will win.
The last I'll say about this, Lindsay, and thank you for a wonderful day. You know, our purpose is to provide context and clarification, and I think we have. I think people can see that this is not an unprecedented moment in American history. That there have been other crises of the First Amendment, other crises of dissent in the last couple of years. But I would urge us to not. I hate whataboutism. I think whataboutism is one of the worst things that has happened to the argument in our time. But I would do a reverse lensism. And I would say to someone like Pete Hegseth, what happens when it's the other party and they want to prevent your dissent about things that are going on in the Department of Defense, things that are going on in the Treasury, things that are going on in the White House? In other words, these people seldom think through what it would look like if the lens were reversed. And I think if they did, they would say, oh my goodness, the Republicans are almost certainly not going to be in power forever. If the Democrats use some of those same tactics, and I think they will argue that they already have done some of that, but if they use those same tactics, you're going to be very disappointed in the results. I don't think we get enough of that looking in the mirror in this country.
Well, that was the exact same argument that Ted Cruz made to defend Jimmy Kimmel.
There you go, Ted Cruz, man. On that bipartisan note, we close for today. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America, and Lindsay will be back before you know it. Stay tuned.